Depending on where you live, the Roman Empire's defeat at Manzikert in 1071 means very different things. For some, it marks the beginning of the doom and gloom of Christianity versus Islam.
Free Constantinople!
For others, it is the triumph of the mighty Turkish warriors over what is sometimes regarded as the greatest empire in history. But it is not the battle itself that led to the empire's demise, because by 1071, Byzantium had already been changing for centuries. Manzikert was not the cause, it was the exposure of structural decay. And if this is what you want to learn about, this may be the right place. Our story begins not in 1071, but in 395. When the Roman Empire split into Western and Eastern halves. To understand the reasons behind the split, we need to go back even further, to the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284, Rome faced simultaneous pressures, barbarian invasions along its northern frontiers, war with the Sasanian Persians, epidemic disease, and severe fiscal contraction. At its core, Rome was a fiscal military system. As long as the state could extract agricultural surplus, convert it into coin, and use that coin to maintain armies, imperial unity could be preserved. But when population declined, that cycle broke, feeding another one of political instability. Emperors rose and fell rapidly, because the state could no longer reliably sustain military loyalty. Late Roman reforms stabilized the situation by reorganizing administration and dividing authority, but they could not solve a deeper issue. The empire had become too large and too unevenly developed to function as a single integrated system. The formal division of 395 did not create two empires. It simply acknowledged that they were already operating differently, and from then on, both halves would follow very different trajectories. The western provinces were less urbanized, less monetized, and fiscally weaker. As revenues continued to decline, Western emperors increasingly compensated by granting land to Germanic military leaders, the famous feoderati, in exchange for service and defense. What began as a pragmatic solution gradually eroded central authority, facilitating the emergence of autonomous barbarian kingdoms. By 476, the Western Empire no longer functioned as a coherent state. In the East, however, the outcome was very different. The survival of the Eastern Roman Empire, often called Byzantium after the Greek settlement on which Constantinople was built, should not be mistaken for an age of peace and stability that lasted unbroken until the Turks arrived. The centuries leading to Manzikert were marked by constant pressure, from outside and from within. Compared to the West, it was off to a better start, though. The East still controlled the richest Roman provinces. It had dense populations, functioning cities, active trade routes, and a solid tax base, even after the demographic crisis of the 3rd century. But most importantly, the state had preserved two institutional pillars that the West gradually lost: a functioning tax bureaucracy and a stable gold currency, the solidus. Regular taxation meant regular pay for soldiers. The gold currency allowed the state to buy loyalty, hire manpower, and maintain diplomatic leverage. Yet, the Eastern Roman Empire faced the same structural problems that had destroyed the West. It just managed them differently. First of all, it had inherited the Eastern Front against the Persians, leading to repeated wars for the strategic control of the Caucasus, Armenia, and Mesopotamia. In the Balkans, the frontier functioned as a revolving door for migrating and raiding groups seeking tribute, such as the Goths and later the Huns. Manpower was another problem, and the empire also relied on feoderati, these non-Roman soldiers recruited from outside imperial borders. Goths and Huns served in large numbers. The difference from the West lay in control. In the East, these forces were paid in gold. They remained under imperial command and were stationed mainly on frontiers. When land was granted, it was conditional and reversible. Rebellions did occur, but they were suppressed. The state remained the ultimate military organizer. Instability persisted, but fragmentation was avoided. Now, political succession was another weakness. Unlike what people usually assume, the Roman Empire never had a fixed legal system for transferring imperial power. Succession blended dynastic inheritance, military backing, and bureaucratic negotiation. Strong frontier generals were necessary for defense, yet they also controlled troops and regional patronage networks. This repeatedly produced civil wars and usurpations, and as you might expect, each civil conflict drained resources and weakened frontier defense. Finally, religious division compounded these tensions. In 313, Constantine the Great integrated the church into imperial administration. The goal was clear: absorb a potential rival and create a unifying faith to stabilize a fragmented empire. But a century later, unity had not materialized. Disputes over the nature of Christ had mapped onto deeper regional fractures, frequently overlapping with political and socioeconomic interests. While the Council of Chalcedon in 451 eventually ruled that Christ was both fully divine and human, this decree was rejected in Egypt and much of Syria, where Miaphysite Christianity remained dominant. For centuries to follow, local elites leveraged this religious identity as a tool to resist taxation and keep wealth and administrative control out of the hands of Constantinople. Imperial policy often oscillated between repression and compromise, creating long-term mistrust between the imperial center and some of its wealthiest provinces. These tensions didn't destroy the empire, but they caused fragility. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that it remained like that up until the arrival of the Turks. In the 6th century, however, some semblance of stability returned under Anastasius I. By then, the Huns had collapsed after the death of their leader, Attila. Large internal revolts had been suppressed. When conflict with Persia could not be avoided, Anastasius fought carefully, but whenever possible, he preferred annual payments to full-scale war. Thus, breathing space mattered, especially for the economy. Overland trade routes could link Europe and Asia again. When economic activity expands while state spending is kept in check, surplus accumulates. And that's exactly what happened. True, the Balkans were still fragile after decades of Gothic and Hunnic devastation, but the core provinces of Asia Minor and Egypt were productive and fiscally reliable. For the first time since the 3rd century, the Roman Empire appeared not merely stable, but financially strong. But this wouldn't last long. In 527, Justinian I came to power with a clear ambition: the restoration of Roman greatness in law, faith, and territory. This program required unprecedented power centralization and expenditure. Justinian began his consolidation with law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, which is still the backbone of many legal systems worldwide, reorganized centuries of Roman law into a coherent system. It reduced regional variation and strengthened central oversight. Taxation became more standardized. At the same time, Justinian intensified religious enforcement. Chalcedonian orthodoxy became a tool of central integration. Pagan institutions were closed, including the Neoplatonic Academy in Athens in 529, which for some marks the symbolic end of classical Greek philosophy, even though it continued elsewhere. This was not a ban on knowledge, as much as it was an attempt at silencing alternative centers of authority. This move simply ensured that elite advancement in education solely depended on integration into the imperial Christian framework. But naturally, this policy exacerbated tensions in other provinces. Then came Reconquest. Justinian was determined to reclaim former Roman territories, campaigns that demanded enormous financial resources. Taxation increased accordingly. Yet heavy taxes, combined with corruption and the consolidation of power, generated a widespread discontent, culminating in the famous Nika riots of 532. These riots were violently suppressed, which in turn allowed the emperor to project authority even more broadly, including through monumental architectural projects such as Hagia Sophia, intended to signal divine favor and imperial supremacy. But this supremacy was sometimes associated with poor strategic thinking. Campaigns in North Africa, Spain, and Italy reopened Western France, and although these territories were retaken, they left the lands devastated. Worse yet, military victories did not create lasting structural strength. They merely redistributed vulnerability. Troop withdrawals from one frontier left others exposed. New nomadic groups, likely remnants of hiding power, roamed at the frontiers and exploited these weaknesses. Persian forces also attacked opportunistically whenever attention shifted westward. Then came a shock the state could not control. In 542, the plague of Justinian struck the empire, recurring in waves for decades. War had already strained the system, but now there were even fewer soldiers and taxpayers to keep it running. When Justinian died in 565, the empire still stood, but it was severely weakened. And it is in that context that the second protagonist of our story must enter the stage. Here come the Turks. Many people often think that the Romans first encountered the Turks during the Seljuk invasions of the 11th century. But in reality, contacts between the two groups started much earlier than that. By the late 6th century, the empire was weakened, but it was about to get worse. By then, Slavic groups had started moving southward across the Danube, partly driven by the arrival of the Avars, a nomadic group from the steppes that had absorbed some remnants of the ruined confederation in Central Asia after its defeat to the Göktürk Khaganate, which you may remember if you watched part 1 of the series on Anatolia and the Turks. Over time, the Avars dominated the Slavs and extended raids deeper into the Balkans. What followed were decades of shifting arrangements with the Romans, including temporary alliances, tribute demands, raids, and counter-treaties. At the same time, the Göktürks, who were now controlling Central Asia, wanted full control over their section of the Silk Road. To do this, they needed to find a way around the Persian trade routes. So, in 568, they sent a delegation to Constantinople to propose a new northern trade route that bypassed Persia entirely. This was Byzantium's first direct engagement with the Turks, and it was driven by a shared goal: weakening the Persian Empire. But this commercial relationship would soon turn into something bigger. By the end of the 6th century, the conflict between Byzantium and the Sasanians had reignited. Years of intermittent warfare, revolts in the regions of Armenia that had fallen under Persian control, disputes over tribute, and, ultimately, the Persian seizure of Syria and Egypt pushed the two empires into a final devastating confrontation. Facing existential pressure, Roman Emperor Heraclius made a decisive strategic move. He forged a military alliance with the Western Göktürks and drove deep into Persian territory. The gamble worked. Rome emerged victorious, but both were exhausted. The Western Göktürk Khaganate, meanwhile, was fracturing under internal strife. Across the entire region, old powers were hollowed out, frontiers were unmanned, and populations were depleted. And into that vacuum stepped a force that neither Constantinople nor Persia had seen coming: the Muslims. Just like the Turks, the Arabs were not unknown actors suddenly appearing on the eastern frontier. They had been a fixture of Roman strategic thinking for centuries. Imperial commanders had long relied on Arab client chiefs in the Syrian desert, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain and the fast, mobile combat style to raid Persian territory and screen the frontier. Constantinople knew exactly who they were. What changed was the scale and cohesion of what emerged from Arabia in the 630s. The Arab armies sweeping north had turned traditional desert warfare into a superior strategy. Their forces were incredibly mobile, moving quickly across dry terrain that stalled traditional imperial armies. By using camels for logistics, they could maintain campaigns in regions where Byzantine supplies were weakest. Meanwhile, the Byzantine defense, built on fixed lines and fortified cities, was already crumbling after decades of war with Persia. So the losses came quickly. Syria and Palestine fell in the 630s. Egypt followed between 640 and 42. These were not peripheral territories. They were the Roman economic core. And this would have fatal consequences for the future of the empire. By the mid-600s, the empire faced a structural crisis. Since it had lost so much territory to the Muslims, it could no longer collect the taxes and resources needed to fund its administration and defense. The empire's new core, Anatolia, also presented a unique challenge. It had plenty of land, a shrinking population, very little cash, and constant pressure from fast-moving Arab cavalry raids. To survive, the empire developed the theme system. Under this system, soldiers received land instead of salaries. These soldier farmers, called stratiotai in Greek, defended the land that they worked, creating a self-sustaining defense network. Each stratiotes produced both food and military service, combining farming, taxation, and defense into a single structure that allowed Anatolia to protect itself with minimal cash. Over time, what began as military districts became civil administrative regions led by strategos, who held both military and civil authority. By the early 8th century, Byzantium had fundamentally changed. It was no longer the cosmopolitan, urbanized Eastern Roman Empire of late antiquity. It had become a military-centered agrarian state focused on Anatolia. But it is this foundation that allowed the empire to survive. However, this doesn't mean it was spared any internal strife, as evidenced by the 20 years anarchy. Despite its success, the theme system carried a built-in danger. Each theme was a self-sustaining military district. Its strategos controlled local troops and tax revenue. Soldiers often felt loyalty to their general and not to the distant emperor in Constantinople. Powerful themes sometimes possessed more practical force than the throne itself. Naturally, this created a cycle of opportunism. In just 20 years, 7 emperors seized the throne, most through thematic revolts. But the civil wars left the empire's borders exposed, allowing the Arabs to advance in the east, and Slavic groups to further expand in the Balkans and around the Aegean. The chaos ended in 717 when Leo III, himself strategos of the Anatolian theme, took power. Ironically, Leo, who reportedly spoke Arabic fluently, had originally made common cause with the Arabs to march on Constantinople. But he deceived them, seized the city for himself, and then faced the very army he had just deceived. But Leo was not alone. An unexpected new actor would help him out. In 716, Byzantium had concluded a treaty with the newly arrived Bulgars, regulating tribute. The Bulgars themselves were a Turkic people who had emerged from the fragmentation that followed the collapse of the Göktürk Khaganate in the 650s. By the early 8th century, taking advantage of the weakening of the Avars, they had consolidated north of the Danube and established a permanent presence in the Balkans. And they, too, were not happy with the Arab advance. When the Arabs laid siege to Constantinople in 717, large forces encamped in Thrace, directly along the Bulgarian frontier. This created an immediate threat to the Bulgars, who saw the presence of such a large force as a direct danger. During the siege, Bulgarian forces struck the Arab troops, inflicting heavy losses and significantly contributing to the failure of the siege. To destroy the Arab fleet and break the siege, Leo also relied on the city's legendary walls and the use of Greek fire, a technology whose formula is lost. The successful defense saved the empire and restored confidence in imperial authority. But Constantinople's new military success was not enough to sustain the defense of an empire. So, throughout their reigns, Leo and his son, Constantine V, maintained strategic relations with Turkic steppe powers, including the Khazars, who had also emerged from the fragmentation of the Göktürk, strengthening alliances in the Caucasus against Arab expansion. But more importantly, they addressed structural instability. First, they divided the large themes into smaller units. No single general would again command overwhelming regional power. Coups did not disappear, but rebellions became less frequent and less systematically dangerous. Second, they reformed finance and law to strengthen central control. One of the most controversial policies was Iconoclasm, the banning of religious icons. This allowed the state to control church property and redirect wealth to the army. The policy's origins remain debated. Whether influenced by Islamic aniconism or driven by fiscal necessity, it aimed to enforce power centralization and unity during an existential struggle with the caliphate. But the most consequential reform of this period was undoubtedly the creation of the Tagmata, a decision whose long-term effects would, in part, shape the road to Manzikert. After a revolt by the Opsikian theme, Constantine V further reduced provincial power by creating the Tagmata, professional regiments stationed near Constantinople and paid directly from the treasury. The Tagmata served three purposes. They were a central army for offensive campaigns, a security force against rebellious themes, and a counterweight to the strategoi. The empire could now rely on two systems, the themes, for local defense, and the Tagmata that guaranteed central authority and offensive capability. Under Constantine V, fortified frontier passes, forward defense zones, and sustained counter-raids stabilized the Arab frontier. After more than a century of contraction, demographic decline slowed and gradually reversed. Abandoned lands were recultivated, trade revived. With greater stability, the imperial treasury could fund limited offensive operations and maintain the Tagmata. And just like that, a new era was about to begin. Under the Macedonian dynasty, the empire shifted from defense to offense, not because it had suddenly become exceptionally strong, but because its primary enemy was fragmenting. By the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had grown too large to govern effectively from Baghdad. Provincial governors who controlled local tax bases and armies no longer needed the capital to operate and generate wealth. Rich regions like Egypt, Syria, Persia, and Mesopotamia became self-sufficient fiscal military zones. That's how regional dynasties started to emerge. They paid nominal allegiance to the caliph, but in practice, they ruled independently. This was the natural outcome of a tributary state whose fiscal reach exceeded its coercive grip. This fragmentation fundamentally transformed the strategic balance. Under a unified caliphate, Byzantium faced coordinated pressure. After fragmentation, that pressure dissolved. Crucially, these regional dynasties competed with each other as intensely as they fought the Romans, contesting trade routes and regional dominance. This prevented any unified assault. Raids continued, but they no longer compounded into existential crises. From the late 9th century onward, Byzantine emperors systematically exploited this opportunity, reclaiming much territory lost in the 7th century. And yet again, just like in the past, military success produced new problems, some of which would lead to the empire's demise. The reconquests and the renewed might had brought to the fore a new class, the Dynatoi, or the powerful ones. These were a landed aristocracy who held most of the higher military, civil, and ecclesiastical positions. The question is, how did they become so powerful? At the time, trade and industry were rigidly controlled by the government. The only profitable form of private investment was acquiring landed property. Military campaigns had led to increased reliance on the Tagmata. But funding these professional troops and offensive operations required intensified cash taxation. For peasant soldiers, this created a double burden. They still owed military service based on landholding, but now faced rising cash tax demands. Unlike this aristocracy, the stratiotai had limited access to liquidity. A bad harvest, family emergency, or unexpected levy could push them into debt. Population recovery, which should have been a sign of strength, had intensified pressure because land became scarcer. Under these conditions, peasants often only had one option to meet the cash obligations: sell their land. That's how the Dynatoi began buying up land, reducing the owners to varying forms of dependence. Powerful families controlled vast estates and even ended up raising their own military retinues, wielding enormous regional influence. As smallholders sold land, the themes naturally lost manpower. As themes weakened, the empire relied more heavily on the Tagmata and, increasingly, on aristocratic military retinues. By the late 10th century, the Dynatoi had become a recognizable class, uniting land ownership, military command, and state office in the same hands. This created a paradox. The state depended on the Dynatoi to collect taxes and mobilize troops, but the Dynatoi's power came from absorbing the very lands that sustained the theme system. Emperors recognized the danger. Romanos I and Basil II repeatedly passed laws to protect peasant land holdings, imposing brutal restrictions. But enforcement was uneven. Provincial judges were often themselves members of the landed aristocracy. They had every incentive to ignore or circumvent laws limiting their own wealth. Fearing possible usurpation by these military magnates, Basil, who was known for his austere character and hands-on approach, also expanded reliance on foreign mercenaries and demanded more taxes in cash rather than service. This further deepened structural erosion. And yet, from the outside, the future of the empire seemed promising. By the end of Basil II's reign in 1025, Byzantium had reached the apex of its medieval power. The Balkans were secured after conquering the Bulgarian Empire. The treasury was full. But internally, the empire was more fragmented than ever. After 1025, no emperor proved capable of containing the power of the Dynatoi. Aristocrats accelerated land acquisition without effective imperial pushback. The themes, which had remained effective through Basil's reign primarily through imperial coercion, began their terminal decline. The central government lost control over regional military commanders, and to make things worse, the state increasingly relied on expensive and unreliable foreign mercenaries who demanded continuous resource mobilization. By the 11th century, Byzantium was caught in a vicious cycle, and every time the cycle repeated, it accelerated decline. But most importantly, Byzantium recovery and expansion did not result from a surge in inherent imperial strength. It was enabled by the structural fragmentation of Muslim power. The Macedonian reconquests were victories over a political vacuum, not over an equally unified opponent. So yes, by the 11th century, the empire had reached its greatest territorial extent since Justinian I, and it stood at its height, unaware that this would be its last. The first region of the empire to encounter the Seljuk Turks was not Anatolia proper. It was Armenia. For centuries, just as it had relied on Arab federates along the Syrian frontier, Byzantium relied on Armenian rulers as client powers along its northeastern border. From late antiquity onward, these Armenian rulers functioned as a buffer zone between empire and steppe. The arrangement was not continuous, though. Arab domination from the 7th to the 9th centuries had displaced earlier Byzantine influence, but by the 10th century, as imperial power revived, a network of semi-autonomous Armenian principalities once again formed an effective defensive belt. They provided light cavalry, intelligence, and fortified strongholds, while retaining the lands, tax privileges and imperial recognition. In the 11th century, however, Constantinople altered its strategy. The emperors began annexing these principalities directly. The buffer was no longer seen as necessary. On paper, this looked like consolidation. Direct rule promised tighter fiscal integration and greater manpower. Armenia was productive and strategically vital. Incorporating it seemed logical. By eliminating semi-autonomous frontier powers, Byzantium removed a decentralized layer of defense. When pressure came, there would be no independent regional structure to absorb the first shock. And pressure did come. The first arrivals were not Sultan Alp Arslan himself, but Turkmen pastoral bands seeking pasture, plunder, and opportunity. As discussed in the first video, Alp Arslan had directed Turkmen energies outward toward the Armenian highlands in order to stabilize his core territories. Actually, his own focus lay south, in Syria, where control meant religious legitimacy and access to Eastern Mediterranean trade. Armenia, and certainly Anatolia, was not yet his primary objective. Left unchecked, Turkmen raiders tested the frontier. They struck lightly defended districts and withdrew. Under a functioning theme system, such pressure might have been contained. But the thematic structure had already weakened. Frontier garrisons were thin, and Armenia no longer functioned as a semi-autonomous shield. Raids intensified. When Turkmen forces sacked Caesarea, one of Anatolia's major cities, Constantinople finally recognized the scale of the threat. After the death of Constantine X, the empire lacked an adult ruler. His sons were minors, so in 1068, Romanos IV, an experienced general, was elevated to the throne with a clear mandate: restore the eastern frontier. Rapidly, he reorganized defenses and constructed fortifications in eastern Anatolia, but by 1071, he concluded that defensive measures were insufficient. The Turks had to be confronted directly. The army he led east was large, but structurally fragile. It included remnants of thematic troops, central regiments of the Tagmata, Armenian contingents, and numerous mercenaries, including some Turks, whose loyalty depended on payment. Cohesion was uneven. Command unity was delicate. And when Sultan Alp Arslan learned that a substantial Roman army was advancing toward Manzikert, a contested frontier fortress, he could not ignore it. Abandoning his Syrian operations, he pivoted north to confront Romanos. At Manzikert, Roman fragmentation proved fatal. Sections of the army lost formation. Miscommunication spread. Some units believed the emperor had fallen. Mercenary contingents, including Norman and Pecheneck elements, defected. The imperial line collapsed, and Romanos was captured. Yet, the battlefield defeat alone did not destroy Byzantine Anatolia. Many units survived. Alp Arslan released Romanos after negotiating a treaty involving tribute and territorial concessions. Actually, the decisive collapse came afterward. When Romanos returned to Constantinople, he found not unity, but hostility. His prestige was shattered. Rival factions refused to recognize him. Civil war erupted. Ironically, it is civil war that transformed temporary raiders into embedded actors. As rival emperors fought for the throne, Anatolia was stripped of coordinated defense. Roman factions hired Turkmen mercenaries against one another. Those mercenaries gained familiarity with fortresses, supply routes, and terrain. Payment often came in plunder or rights of settlement. What began as hired services eventually became permanent footholds. The conquest of Anatolia was not executed in a single campaign. Turkmen bands moved gradually, settling in the countryside, occupying strongholds, displacing rural populations, and establishing durable presence while imperial authority fractured. This was not a planned imperial invasion. It was structural vacancy amplified by civil war. Between 1071 and 1081, imperial control across most of Anatolia disintegrated. By the time Alexios I secured the throne, the interior had largely passed beyond effective Byzantine authority, and the Anatolian interior would never return to sustained imperial control. Before wrapping up, we need to answer the obvious question. Why did the Turks succeed where the Arabs failed? At the height, the Umayyads and the Abbasids were richer, more centralized, and far more administratively developed than the Turks. They invaded Anatolia repeatedly, and yet they never managed to secure permanent control. The Turks, by contrast, transformed the region within a few decades. Why? Well, the answer lies in three differences: ecology, the nature of the conflict, and timing. First of all, early Arab armies were organized around desert warfare. Camels played a major logistical role. They excelled at raids, sieges, and rapid seasonal campaigns. But the Anatolian plateau was not a natural extension of that environment. Its winters were harsher. Its terrain was mountainous and forested in many regions. Campaigns required long supply chains and heavy state financing. Arab forces could raid deeply, devastate cities, and extract tribute. But large-scale settlement was difficult. The warfare remained seasonal. Armies advanced and then withdrew. But the August Turks, who entered Anatolia in the 11th century, were different. They were steppe pastoralists, horse-based, mobile. The social structure revolved around herds, not urban supply chains. Anatolia's highlands resembled the steppe zones they already knew. They did not arrive only as soldiers. They arrived with families, with flocks, with tribal networks. They did not depend on the distant treasury. Their economy moved with them. Raiding gradually turned into wintering. Wintering turned into settlement. This was not invasion. It was migration. The nature of the conflict was also very different. The Arab-Byzantine struggle was largely state versus state. The Seljuk expansion into Anatolia was not purely directed from the center. Even when Sultan Alp Arslan focused on Syria, Turkmen tribal groups continued pushing westward. They were not temporary expeditionary forces. When defeated, they did not disappear. They dispersed, regrouped, and returned. You can defeat an army, but you cannot defeat migration the same way. And finally, timing. The Arabs confronted Byzantium when the empire still relied on the theme system. Even after major defeats, provincial society could regenerate resistance. But as we saw, by the 11th century, that system had eroded. Then came civil war. The eastern provinces were left without coordinated defense. What had once been frontier pressure became permanent penetration. So the difference was not a single battle. And once settlement began, Anatolia was transformed forever. But this will be a story for another time. Thank you so much for watching this video till the end. Sorry it took me so long to post it once again, but even though the time span covered here is not as long as in the previous one, it was still difficult to assemble all the causes in a coherent way. And also, if you have ever animated anything yourself, you know how demanding and long the process can be, so I appreciate your patience. Now, if you would like to support my work, feel free to give this video a like, as it apparently helps. And if you enjoyed it and found it interesting, I might see you in the fourth and last part of this series, where we will obviously be discussing the Turkification process of Anatolia. Bye-bye.